There is a moment you know well, even if you have never described it out loud. Someone says something small, something that should not matter, and within a second your chest tightens, your jaw sets, and a heat rises through your body that feels almost separate from you, as if it arrived before you had any say in it. Maybe it was a comment from your spouse over dinner. Maybe it was a driver who cut you off on a road you have driven 1,000 times. Maybe it was your own child, or your own reflection in a mirror at the end of a long day, or a memory that resurfaced uninvited while you were doing something as ordinary as washing dishes. And in that moment, something old in you took the wheel, and you said or did something you quietly regretted an hour later, or a day later, or years later. Yes, perhaps you have noticed a strange detail about these moments. They rarely feel like a choice while they are happening. There is no deliberation, no weighing of options, no calm internal voice asking whether this reaction serves you. There is only the surge, and then the aftermath, and then the familiar quiet guilt that follows. Once the heat has passed and you are left standing in the wreckage of a conversation you cannot take back. You have likely apologized for this more than once. You have likely promised yourself, in the private stillness of a late evening, that you will be different next time. And for a while, perhaps you were. You are not alone in this, and you are not broken because of it. But you have likely noticed, especially as the years have passed, that this pattern does not fade on its own. If anything, it becomes more familiar, more automatic, more woven into the fabric of ordinary days. You tell yourself you will handle it differently next time, and then next time arrives, and the same current pulls you under. This is not a story about becoming a different person. It is a story about understanding something that has been hiding in plain sight your entire life, something that, once seen clearly, changes the way anger moves through you forever. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something important. Anger itself is not the enemy. It is not a defect in your character, nor a sign of moral failure. Anger has existed in every human being, across every culture and every era, because it serves a purpose, alerting you to a boundary that has been crossed or a value that feels threatened. The difficulty is never that anger exists. The difficulty is that, for many people, anger has become the loudest voice in the room, arriving faster and staying longer than it needs to, drowning out every quieter, wiser part of the mind that might otherwise guide a more measured response. Anger is rarely about what it appears to be about. The raised voice, the slammed door, the silence that lasts 3 days longer than it should. These are only the visible edges of something much older and much quieter underneath. Most people spend their whole lives managing the surface of their anger, apologizing for outbursts, promising restraint, practicing patience through sheer willpower, without ever turning to look at what is actually generating the heat in the first place. And willpower, as anyone who has tried it knows, is a limited resource. It works for a while, and then a difficult day arrives, and the well runs dry, and the old pattern returns exactly as it always has. This is why so many capable, intelligent, deeply caring people still find themselves ambushed by their own reactions later in life. It has nothing to do with intelligence or character. A person can be remarkably wise in every other area of their life, respected at work, gentle with strangers, thoughtful in matters of business or friendship, and still find themselves shaking with frustration over something as small as a misplaced set of keys or a spouse who forgot to mention a phone call. The reason is that anger does not answer to logic in the moment it arrives. It answers to something faster, something that operates beneath conscious thought, something shaped by decades of experience, long before you ever had the tools to question it. By the time your rational mind arrives to assess the situation, the emotional reaction has often already run its course, leaving reason to clean up after the fact rather than guide the moment as it unfolds. And the cost of this is rarely dramatic. It rarely shows up as a single catastrophic event that forces you to confront it directly. Instead, it erodes things slowly, the way water erodes stone, so gradually that you barely notice the shape of your life changing until years have passed. A marriage grows quieter, not because love has disappeared, but because both people have learned to walk carefully around certain subjects, avoiding topics that might spark the old familiar heat. A friendship fades, not through a single fight, but through the accumulated weight of moments where irritation was chosen over patience, where a sharp word created distance that neither person quite knew how to close again. Confidence weakens, because a part of you knows that you are not fully in control of your own reactions, and that knowledge sits uncomfortably beneath the surface of everyday life. whispering that you cannot fully trust yourself in difficult moments. Peace of mind becomes something you visit occasionally, in brief quiet mornings or long walks, rather than something you live inside as a steady foundation. There is also a quieter cost that rarely gets named, and that is the exhaustion of it all. Anger takes energy. The body that clenches, the mind that replays an argument for hours afterward, the sleep that comes late because the mind is still turning over what was said and what should have been said. Instead, all of this drains a person slowly. Many people who consider themselves simply tired, simply worn down by life, are in fact worn down by years of unprocessed reactivity, carrying the residue of arguments and irritations long after the original moment has passed. The central shift that changes everything is this. Anger is not something that happens to you. It is something that happens through an interpretation you make so quickly you never notice. You made it. Between the event and the reaction, there is a gap, a space where a judgment forms almost instantly, a judgment about what the event means, about what it says about you, about whether it threatens something you value. That judgment, not the event itself, is what produces the heat. Two people can experience the identical situation, the same delayed flight, the same rude comment from a stranger, the same forgotten anniversary, and one will feel a flicker of mild annoyance, while the other feels rage strong enough to ruin the rest of the day. The difference is not the event. The difference is the meaning each person unconsciously assigned to it in that split second, before feeling arrived. This single realization, once it is truly understood rather than simply heard, begins to loosen the grip that anger has held for so long. It does not eliminate the feeling. It does something more useful. It creates a small but meaningful distance between what happens to you and how you respond to it. And within that distance lies the entire possibility of change. This idea is not new, though it is often forgotten in the noise of modern life. Centuries ago, a man named Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire and carried the weight of constant pressure, war, political betrayal, the slow decline of his own health, wrote privately to himself about this very struggle. He was not writing for an audience or for glory. He was writing reminders to keep himself steady during years that offered him very little, the steadiness from the outside world. One of his recurring themes was that it is never the outer event that disturbs a person, but the inner judgment about that event. He understood that a ruler who could not govern his own reactions was not truly in control of anything, regardless of how much power he held over armies or territories. His private reflections were not about suppressing emotion or pretending difficulty did not exist. They were about examining the thought that arrived just before the emotion, and questioning gently whether that thought was actually true, or whether it was simply the fastest available interpretation in a stressful moment. Around the same era, another Roman thinker named Seneca devoted an entire body of writing to the subject of anger specifically, having watched it destroy relationships, careers, and in the political world he inhabited, sometimes even lives. He observed something that still holds true today, that anger often disguises itself as strength, as righteous conviction, as justified defense, when in reality it frequently causes far more damage than whatever provoked it in the first place. Seneca noticed that people rarely regret their calm responses, but they very often regret the things said in anger, words that cannot be unsaid once they have landed in another person's memory. He argued that the wise course was not to eliminate strong feeling entirely, which he considered neither possible nor desirable, but to create enough space before responding that the response could be chosen rather than triggered. He suggested that a brief pause, even a single breath held before speaking, could be the birding between a moment handled with dignity and a moment regretted for years afterward. On the other side of the world, and generations later, the Buddhist tradition explored this same territory through a different lens entirely. One, less concerned with rulers and empires, and more concerned with the quiet architecture of the Tong, mind itself. Central to Buddhist teaching is the idea that suffering often arises not from circumstances themselves, but from a mind that clings tightly to how things should be, and reacts with aversion when reality does not match that expectation. Anger, in this view, is a form of resistance to what is already happening, a refusal to accept a moment as it is, and this refusal creates a friction that burns the person, feeling it far more than it burns anyone else involved in the situation. This is not a call toward passivity, or toward accepting genuine harm without response. It is an invitation to meet difficult moments with clarity instead of resistance, to see clearly what is happening before deciding how to respond to it, rather than responding from the resistance itself. In the modern era, the psychologist and philosopher William James proposed something that reshaped how emotion itself is understood in Western thought. He suggested that the physical sensations of emotion, the tightened chest, the clenched hands, the shallow breath, are not simply the result of feeling angry, but are deeply intertwined with the feeling itself, sometimes even preceding conscious awareness of the emotion entirely. This means the body is not just a passenger during anger, it is an active participant, which also means that changing the body's state, even something as simple as breath and posture, can genuinely influence the emotional experience unfolding within it. This bridges ancient philosophy and modern psychology in a way that feels remarkably practical for anyone trying to change a lifelong pattern, because it suggests that the body itself can become part of the solution rather than simply a symptom of the problem. Taken together, these four perspectives, separated by centuries, continents, and entirely different worldviews, arrive at a strikingly similar conclusion. Anger is shaped far more by interpretation, resistance, and physical state than by the event itself, and each of these elements can be worked with directly, given enough patience and honest attention. Understanding the psychology behind anger requires letting go of the idea that emotions are irrational accidents, random storms that arrive without cause or explanation. They are not accidents. They are fast, efficient interpretations built from every similar moment you have lived through before, refined over years into a kind of shortcut your mind uses to protect you quickly, without the delay of careful thought. If you grew up in an environment where raised voices signaled danger, where a parent's anger meant something unpredictable was about to happen, your nervous system learned to treat raised voices as danger, and it will continue reacting that way decades later, even in a context where there is no actual threat present, even when the raised voice belongs to someone who loves you and means no harm at all. This is not a flaw in your character. It is simply how a mind that is built to keep you safe tends to operate, generalizing quickly from past experience rather than evaluating each new moment fresh on its own terms. The problem is not that this system exists. Every human being carries some version of it. The problem is that most people never learn to notice it happening in real time, so they mistake the reaction for the truth rather than recognizing it as a pattern, a well-worn path the mind travels simply because it has traveled it so many times before. Attention plays a significant role here as well, often an underestimated one. In the seconds after a triggering event, your mind will naturally search for evidence that supports the initial flash of anger, almost like a lawyer building a case it has already decided to win. If you feel disrespected, your attention will narrow onto every detail that confirms disrespect. The tone of voice, the timing of the comment, the memory of a similar slight from years ago, while quietly ignoring details that might soften or explain the situation, such as the other person's exhaustion or their own stress, or the possibility that no offense was intended at all. This is not a deliberate distortion. It happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness, and it is one of the primary reasons anger tends to escalate rather than settle once it begins. The very attention that could calm the moment instead becomes fuel for the fire, unless something interrupts the pattern early enough to change its direction before it gathers full momentum. There is also a habitual quality to anger that deserves mention. Just as a muscle strengthens with repeated use, the neural pathways associated with a quick temper strengthen each time they are activated, making the next angry reaction slightly easier and slightly faster to trigger than the one before it. This is discouraging news for anyone who has lived with a short temper for many years, because it suggests the pattern has genuinely deepened over time. But it is also encouraging news, because it means the opposite is equally true. Each time you interrupt the pattern, even briefly, even imperfectly, you begin to weaken that well-worn path and create the early beginnings of a new one. Here is a small practice you can begin today, one that requires no special equipment, no retreat, no years of study, only a few seconds of honest awareness in the moment it matters most. The next time you feel the earliest signal of anger rising, whether that is heat in your chest, tension in your shoulders, a tightening in your throat, or a subtle clenching in your hands, pause and silently name what you are noticing. Not what caused it, not who is to blame, simply the physical sensation itself. Observe the way you might observe weather moving across a distant sky. You might silently say to yourself, there is heat rising in my chest, or there is tightness in my jaw, or my hands have curled into fists without my permission. This works because naming a sensation activates a different region of the mind than the one driving the automatic reaction, creating a brief gap between stimulus and response, the very gap that Marcus Aurelius and Seneca both wrote about long before modern psychology gave it a name and a mechanism. That gap, even if it lasts only 2 or 3 seconds, is often enough to prevent a reaction you would otherwise regret for far longer than the moment itself lasted. You may find, the first several times you try this, that the anger arrives and passes before you even remember to name anything at all. This is normal, and it is not failure. The practice is not meant to work perfectly on the first attempt. It is meant to be returned to again and again, gently, until noticing becomes slightly more natural each time, until the gap between trigger and reaction becomes slightly wider than it was the week before. Beyond this in-the-moment practice, a nightly ritual can help you understand your own patterns clearly enough that they gradually lose their grip over the course of weeks and months. Each evening, before the day fully closes, sit quietly for a few minutes with a notebook or simply your own thoughts, in a chair by a window or at the edge of your bed, and walk back through any moment when irritation or anger arose during the day. Do not judge the moment or scold yourself for it. Simply observe it, the way you might observe weather passing through a valley, present for a while and then gone, neither good nor bad in itself. Ask yourself what specifically triggered the feeling, naming the exact moment as precisely as you can recall it. Ask yourself what you believed the event meant about you in that instant, whether it felt like disrespect or failure or being unseen. Ask yourself whether that belief was actually accurate or whether it was a fast assumption, shaped by old experience rather than by the reality of what was actually happening in front of you. And finally, ask yourself how you might respond if that same situation arose again tomorrow, not as a promise to yourself, but simply as an honest exploration of what a steadier response might look like. This is not about criticizing yourself for the reaction you already had. It is about becoming familiar enough with your own patterns that they stop operating entirely in the dark, where they have quietly run your life for far longer than you realized. Over time, this nightly review begins to reveal something important, a kind of map of your own particular triggers, the specific situations, tones of voice, or types of comments that reliably summon anger faster than others. This map is not meant to shame you. It is meant to prepare you, the way knowing a particular road tends to flood after rain prepares a driver to take a different route rather than being caught by surprise each time. The hidden root cause beneath most chronic anger is rarely the situation people believe is causing it. Far more often, anger is a secondary emotion, a reaction that arrives quickly to protect something more vulnerable underneath. Something like fear, humiliation, grief, or a persistent sense of not being valued or heard. A man who explodes over a minor mistake at work is often not truly angry about the mistake itself, but about an old fear of being seen as inadequate, a fear that may reach back decades to a childhood where mistakes were met with harsh judgment rather than patience. A parent who snaps at a child over spilled milk is often not truly angry about the milk, but about exhaustion and a deeper fear of losing control over an already overwhelming day, a day that already felt like too much before the milk ever hit the floor. This connects directly back to the central idea explored earlier, because the interpretation happening in that split second is almost always tied to something vulnerable the mind is trying urgently to protect, some old wound or fear that anger arrives to shield, the way a hand instinctively rises to protect the face before the mind has even registered a threat. Once you begin asking what your anger might be protecting, rather than only what triggered it on the surface, the entire pattern becomes far easier to understand and far less frightening to face. Anger stops feeling like a mysterious enemy that ambushes you without warning, and starts feeling like a messenger, however clumsy, pointing towards something tender that has needed attention for a very long time. A common misconception deserves to be addressed directly here, because it quietly prevents many people from doing this work at all. Becoming calmer does not mean becoming emotionless, distant, or passive, and it certainly does not mean allowing yourself to be treated poorly without response. Calm is not the absence of feeling. Calm is the presence of enough clarity to choose your response, rather than being controlled by it entirely. A person who has genuinely done this inner work can still feel the heat of frustration rise within them when something unfair happens, but they are no longer swept away by it entirely, carried somewhere they did not intend to go. They can feel injustice clearly and still respond with steadiness rather than destruction, holding both the feeling and the composure at the same time, rather than sacrificing one for the other. This distinction matters deeply, because many people avoid working on their anger out of a fear that they will become cold or numb, easy to walk over, when in truth the opposite tends to happen over time. As reactivity decreases, genuine warmth and presence very often increase, because so much energy that was once spent managing outbursts and repairing their aftermath becomes wise, available for connection instead, for listening more fully, and for being present in ways that constant low-level irritation had quietly prevented for years. The body and mind are far more connected in this process than most people realize, and one of the simplest ways to support this shift is through the breath, which is available to you in every single moment of every single day, requiring no equipment and no special circumstances. When anger rises, breathing naturally becomes shallow and rapid, which reinforces the body's sense of urgency and threat, creating a feedback loop where the breath feeds the anger, and the anger shortens the breath further still. Deliberately slowing the exhale, making it longer than the inhale, sends a different signal to the nervous system, one associated with safety rather than danger, gently interrupting that feedback loop from the body's side rather than only the mind's side. This is not a cure on its own, but combined with the naming practice described earlier, it becomes a genuinely powerful anchor in difficult moments. A short evening walk can serve a similar purpose, giving the mind space to process the day's friction physically rather than carrying it silently into the night and into restless sleep. Posture matters as well, more than many people expect, since a body held tense and rigid throughout the day tends to keep the mind in a similarly tense and rigid state, while consciously relaxing the shoulders and unclenching the jaw at various points during the day can quietly lower the baseline from which anger has to rise. None of this requires anything elaborate or expensive. It simply requires consistency, return to daily, the way any meaningful habit is built over time rather than all at once. When you bring all of this together, a clear and complete way of relating to anger begins to emerge, one built from ancient wisdom, modern psychology, and simple daily practice woven into a single coherent approach. First, you recognize that anger arises not from events themselves, but from the split-second interpretations your mind assigns to them, an idea understood clearly by thinkers separated by centuries and continents, from a Roman emperor writing private reflections to a tradition born in ancient India to a psychologist working in 19th century America. Then, you learn to notice the earliest physical signals of anger before they fully take hold, using that brief awareness to create space rather than reacting automatically the way you have done for years. Next, you begin examining your patterns honestly each evening, not to judge yourself for what already happened, but to understand what your anger has actually been protecting all along. The fear or hurt beneath the heat. Finally, you support this entire process through the body itself, through breath, movement, posture, and simple daily habits that keep your nervous system calmer and more resilient over time, less easily tipped into the old familiar reaction. None of these steps require you to become a different person entirely, someone unrecognizable to yourself or to the people who love you. They require you to become a more honest observer of the person you already are, and from that honest observation, a steadier version of that same person naturally begins to emerge. Nothing about this changes overnight, and anyone who promises otherwise is not being truthful with you. Old patterns took years, sometimes decades to form, and they will not dissolve in a single evening of good intentions. But something does shift the very first time you catch the gap between a trigger and a reaction, even if you do not yet know what to do with that space. Even if you still choose the old reaction anyway on that particular occasion. That single moment of awareness, however small it feels, is the beginning of a different relationship with your own mind, one built gradually through small, consistent practice rather than sudden transformation or dramatic willpower. Tonight, before you close this day, try the naming practice just once. Even if nothing triggers you between now and the moment you fall asleep, notice a sensation, name it quietly, and let that be enough for today, without demanding more of yourself than this single small act of attention. Tomorrow, when irritation rises again, as it inevitably will, because you are human and life will continue to offer difficult moments, you will already be a little more prepared than you were yesterday, carrying just slightly more awareness into a familiar situation. And in time, slowly, through evenings of honest reflection and small pauses taken in difficult moments, you may find that the fire that once controlled you has become something you are finally able to hold, with steady hands, warmed by it rather than burned. If this brought you some clarity tonight, consider staying a little longer, because there is another video waiting that explores this same quiet territory of the mind from a different angle, one that may speak to whatever part of this journey you find yourself standing in right now. Subscribe if you would like these reflections to find you regularly, arriving quietly on evenings when you need them most. And before you go, take one slow breath, longer on the exhale than the inhale, and let that be the first small step of the steadier path ahead. The work you are doing here matters more than it may feel like it does right now.